The ergoth was a walking nightmare of muscle razor scales and jaws. The ergoth was a walking nightmare of muscle razor scales and jaws that could snap a dropship axle. It wasn't supposed to like anyone. It was supposed to terrify the new cadets into submission, pick the strongest alien warlord's kid, and ignore the rest of the meat in the room. Instead, the 1,000 apex predator walked past the galaxy's elite, stopped dead in front of the only human in the hangar, and sat down because real recognizes real and humanity. We're nothing but trouble. The staging bay smelled of ozone, recycled air, and fear. Mostly fear. It seeped out of the pores of 300 cadets representing 14 different star systems, pooling in the heavy artificially pressurized atmosphere of the Coalition Military Academy. Caleb Hayes stood at attention in the third rank, staring straight ahead at the scarred gray bulkhead. His dress uniform was suffocating. The high collar dug into his throat, and the rigid material trapped the sweat sliding down his spine. He didn't shift his weight. He didn't blink. He just breathed slow and shallow, doing the exact same thing he'd done during his 3 tours on the Dust Bowl colonies of the Outer Rim Enduring. He was the only human in the battalion. Humanity was the newest addition to the Galactic Coalition, tolerated rather than respected. To the towering four-armed Cray, standing to his left, Caleb was a novelty. To the sleek, bioluminescent variant to his right, he was an evolutionary joke. Humans were small. They lacked natural armor, venom, or redundant organs. They died easily. Or so the galaxy thought. Caleb knew better. Humans didn't need thick scales when they had an infinite capacity for stubbornness. Eyes front meat. A synthetic voice blared over the PA system. Drill Master Rusk stepped onto the raised gantry overlooking the formation. Rusk was a veteran of the border wars, missing half of his original face, the organic tissue, replaced by crude, brushed steel cybernetics. He paced the catwalk, his heavy boots clanging against the grating. Today is selection. Rusk barked his voice, grating like metal on stone. For the last 6 months, we have broken you down. We have tested your bodies, your minds, and your pathetic excuses for spirits. Most of you are barely fit to scrape the exhaust baffles of a scout ship, but a few of you might just be useful. A low murmur rippled through the front ranks. The alien aristocrats, the ones bred for this academy, puffed out their chests. "Do not get eager," Rusk snapped. "You do not choose, they choose." The heavy blast doors at the far end of the bay hissed, the hydraulic locks disengaging with a series of deep, concussive thuds. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. Caleb felt the Crail beside him tense. A subtle clicking noise came from the Vesperian's mandibles. Caleb just kept his eyes on the bulkhead, but his heart rate ticked up a fraction. He knew what was behind those doors. Everyone did. The war beasts. The Coalition didn't just use technology. In the chaotic, close-order slaughter of ship-to-ship boarding actions and trench warfare, blasters overheated and energy shields failed. That was when they unleashed the Ergaths, genetically stabilized apex predators from a high-gravity death world bred for loyalty, intelligence, and absolute violence. A fully bonded ergoth and its handler were considered a walking heavy weapons platform. But bonding wasn't a science. It was an instinct. The beasts were empathic. They read the micro-expressions, the hormone spikes, the very neural frequency of a potential handler. If they found you wanting, they ignored you. If they found you offensive, they ate you. Keep your hands at your sides, Rusk warned. Do not break formation. Do not make eye contact unless approached. If you flinch, you fail. If you run, I will shoot you myself to save them the digestion. The blast doors ground open. The smell hit first. It was a dense metallic scent like copper coins left in the sun, mixed with the musky raw odor of an open grave. Caleb swallowed hard, forcing his primitive brain to override the sudden screaming instinct to run. 4 handlers, clad in heavy ablative armor, walked out of the darkness. Between them, dragging on 2 thick chains of tempered durasteel, was the beast. It was massive. At the shoulder, it stood taller than Caleb. Its body was a heavily muscled hybrid of feline grace and reptilian brutality, covered in overlapping obsidian black plates that absorbed the harsh overhead lights. Its head was blunt, heavy crown with sensory horns that twitched toward the cadets. A thick spiked tail whipped lazily behind it, gouging trenches into the reinforced deck plates. This wasn't a standard fresh out of the crash pup. This beast was a veteran. Caleb could see the pale, jagged scars crisscrossing its armored hide plasma burns, kinetic impact craters, the desperate slashes of energy swords. It was old, it was mean, and it was deeply, violently bored. The beast let out a low, rumbling growl that vibrated in Caleb's teeth. The handlers strained against the chains, their boots slipping on the metal floor. As Subject 7, Rusk announced it has lost 3 handlers in the last 5 years. It has rejected every candidate since. If it does not choose today, it will be euthanized. Caleb ground his jaw. Euthanized. You don't put down a weapon just because it's picky. But looking at the thing, Caleb understood it was too dangerous to keep around if it wouldn't take orders. The handlers released the tension on the chains just enough to let Subject 7 step up to the first rank of cadets. The beast lowered its massive head, inhaling deeply. The sound of its breathing was like a heavy forge bellows. It stopped in front of a Krail warrior 8 feet tall, bred for combat. The Krail stood rigid, trying to project dominance. Subject 7 didn't even sniff him. It huffed a sound that conveyed absolute contempt and bumped the Kray's chest with its armored snout. The Kray stumbled backward, breaking formation. Fail, Rusk said flatly. Remove him. Security droids dragged the disgraced cadet away. The beast moved on. It walked the line slowly. It paused by a tall, elegant Lyran, sniffing her delicate, double-jointed legs. The Lyran began to tremble. Subject 7 bared its teeth, revealing rows of serrated bone, and let out a sharp, snapping bark. The Lyran collapsed to her knees, sobbing in sheer terror. Fail. Down the line it went. Rank 1 was decimated. Rank 2 fared no better. The beast was searching for something, and whatever it was, the finest genetic stock in the galaxy didn't have it. It didn't want pride. It didn't want rigid program discipline. It finished the second rank and turned the corner, lumbering down the aisle toward the third, toward Caleb. Caleb's breathing slowed. The adrenaline was dumping into his system now, turning the edges of his vision sharp and cold. He felt the familiar icy calm that had kept him alive in the mud trenches of Tardius IV. Panic was useless. Fear was a luxury. There was only the moment and the space between his breaths. Subject 7 stopped 3 cadets away. It sniffed. A Vesperian growled and moved on. 2 cadets away. A heavily armored Dra. The beast didn't even pause. Then it stood in front of Caleb. Up close, the beast was terrifying. The sheer mass of it blocked out the rest of the hangar. Its black armor was pitted and scarred the edges rough. It smelled of old blood and raw ozone. The beast lowered its massive head until it was level with Caleb's chest. It didn't touch him. It just hovered there, pulling in the air. Caleb didn't flinch. He didn't puff out his chest to look bigger. He knew exactly what he was. He was 180 pounds of tired, cynical, fragile meat wrapped in cotton and synthetic leather. He looked back at the beast, his eyes locking onto the deep, smoldering amber of its pupils. "You're tired, too," Caleb thought. He didn't say it. He didn't move his lips. But he felt the exhaustion rolling off the massive predator. The heavy weight of surviving when your pack was gone. The endless grinding cycle of violence. Subject 7's ears flicked. It leaned closer, its damp, leathery nose an inch from Caleb's collarbone. It took a long, deep breath. It smelled the synthetic soap of the academy. It smelled the stale sweat of standing at attention, but beneath that it smelled the distinct bitter tang of human adrenaline. It smelled the microscopic traces of cordite embedded in Caleb's skin from years of cheap atmospheric combat. It smelled the jagged, ugly scars on Caleb's ribs that hadn't healed quite right. It smelled a survivor. The hangar was dead silent. Even Drill Master Rusk had stopped pacing. Every eye was locked on the human and the monster. Subject 7 let out a long, slow exhale that ruffled Caleb's hair. Then the beast turned around, putting its heavily armored back to Caleb's chest. It lowered its massive hindquarters, bent its rear legs, and sat down. The impact shook the deck plates. The beast leaned back, pressing its crushing weight firmly against Caleb's legs. Caleb had to brace his boots apart just to keep from being bowled over. Subject 7 let out a deep, rumbling sigh that sounded entirely too much like a tired old hound finding a rug by the fire. It draped its heavy spiked tail over Caleb's boot, anchoring him there. Then it looked up at Drill Master Rusk and bared its teeth. Not in anger and a warning. "This one is mine. Touch him and you die." For 10 agonizing seconds, the only sound in the staging bay was the hum of the ventilation scrubbers. Caleb stood frozen, staring over the broad, heavily armored skull of the beast, currently using his shins as a backrest. The heat radiating from Subject 7 was intense, soaking right through Caleb's uniform trousers. He could feel the rhythmic, heavy thump of the creature's heart. The Krail to his left was staring his 4 eyes wide in disbelief, mandibles hanging slack. Up on the gantry, Drill Master Rusk gripped the railing, his cybernetic eye whirred, focusing and refocusing as if trying to clear a glitch in his optics. "Handler," Rusk said, his voice unusually quiet. "What is the meaning of this?" The lead handler, a heavily scarred veteran in thick blast armor, swallowed audibly. "It is a submissive guard posture, Drill Master. It's claiming him. It's a human." Rusk spat. "The beast is a Class A siege asset. It requires a handler capable of physically dominating it during a combat frenzy. That flesh bag couldn't hold its leash if it sneezed." Subject 7's ears pinned back flat against its skull. A low vibrating growl started in the beast's chest, echoing through the deck plates and traveling straight up Caleb's spine. The beast didn't turn around, but its heavy head tilted upward, glaring at Rusk. "Easy," Caleb muttered. He didn't even realize he was speaking until the word left his mouth. It was a reflex, the same tone he used to use on the wild feral scrap dogs back in the Detroit runs before he enlisted. The beast immediately stopped growling. It huffed, snapping its jaws once, and rested its chin heavily on its front paws, looking incredibly bored again. Rusk's organic eye twitched. "Cadet Hayes." Rusk commanded, his voice echoing over the PA. "Step away from the beast." Caleb looked at Rusk. Then he looked down at the massive spiked tail wrapped securely around his right ankle. He looked back at Rusk. "Sir," respectfully, Caleb said, his voice dry and carrying clearly in the quiet hangar. "I don't think it wants me to move." "That is an order, Cadet." Caleb sighed inwardly. He was tired. He was so incredibly tired of officers shouting stupid orders. But military doctrine was drilled deep into him. You follow orders. You don't think. He shifted his weight, preparing to take a step back. Subject 7 didn't growl. It didn't snap. It simply turned its massive head, grabbed the thick fabric of Caleb's uniform trouser leg in its teeth, careful to avoid the meat, and pulled hard. Caleb's legs went out from under him. He hit the deck plates hard, landing on his ass with a loud clang. Before he could scramble back to his feet, the beast shifted. It spun its massive bulk around, boxing Caleb in. It lay down in front of him, creating a wall of black armor and muscle between the human on the floor and the rest of the hangar. It rested its chin on Caleb's knee, blinked its amber eyes slowly, and let out a contented sigh. The handler stared. The cadets stared. "Well," Caleb muttered, looking down at the creature, "I guess that's a no." Inside Caleb's head, something clicked. It wasn't a voice. It wasn't words. Empathic bonds weren't like a radio transmission. It was a sudden, violent wash of emotion that wasn't his own. He felt a deep, resonant amusement. He felt a fierce, burning loyalty. But mostly he felt a reflection of his own cynical, battered soul staring back at him. The beast hadn't chosen him because he was strong or noble or pure. It had smelled the violence in him. It had tasted the bitter, jagged edges of a human who had survived a universe that wanted him dead, and it recognized a kindred spirit. "We are the monsters," the feeling said. "We are the ones they loose when the talking stops." Caleb reached out his hand, shaking just a fraction, and laid his bare palm against the thick, warm armor plating of the beast's neck. The creature leaned into his touch. "Drill Master," the lead handler called out, his voice tinged with a mix of awe and terror. "The biometric readouts, their heart rates are synchronizing." Rusk stared down at the human sitting on the floor, pinning an apex predator by doing absolutely nothing. The drill's metal jaw clicked shut. "Cadet Hayes," Rusk said, his voice finally losing its volume. "Yes, Drill Master," Caleb replied from the floor, his hand still resting on the beast. "You have been claimed. Your new designation is Alpha 7. Report to the heavy armor wing." Rusk paused, his single organic eye narrowing. "May the void have mercy on whoever pisses you two off." Caleb didn't smile. He just patted the heavy neck of the war beast. "Come on, buddy. Let's go see our bunk." Subject 7 stood up, towering over Caleb once more. As Caleb began to walk toward the exit, the beast fell in perfectly at his heel, its massive shoulders rolling with a predatory grace. It didn't need the chains anymore. It had found its anchor. Humanity was a mess. They were loud, fragile, and prone to breaking things. But to a creature bred for absolute chaos, Caleb Hyes was something far better than an alien warlord. He was a pack alpha of trouble, and they were just getting started. The heavy armor wing didn't look like a military barracks. It looked like a maximum security containment facility that had briefly considered being a zoo. The bulkheads were reinforced with 3 in of a blade of plating. The bunks were oversized slabs of raw Dura steel, welded directly to the deck. The air was thick with the smell of ammonia wet hide and the aggressive pheromones of alien predators. Caleb walked through the heavy blast doors, his duffel bag slung over one shoulder. Subject 7 lumbered right beside him, its massive armored shoulders occasionally scraping against the corridor walls, sending showers of pale sparks cascading to the floor. The beast didn't seem to notice. Its amber eyes were fixed forward, its heavy tail swaying in a slow, rhythmic pendulum swing. The low hum of conversation inside the barracks died the second Caleb's boots hit the floor plating. There were 20 other handlers in the room. They were giants, Kree warriors pushing 8 feet tall, their 4 heavily muscled arms resting on plasma rifles. Drahivi infantry built like bipedal rhinos, with thick gray skin and zero sense of humor. They were the Coalition's elite, bred and conditioned to handle the galaxy's most lethal biological weapons. And then there was Caleb, 5 feet 10 on a good day, weighing less than a Drax's left leg. A dozen war beasts were chained to the heavy anchor points at the foot of their respective handlers' bunks. They were younger than Subject 7, their armor plates glossy and unmarred, their eyes wide and aggressive. As Subject 7 entered, 3 of the younger beasts stood up, baring their teeth and letting out sharp, challenging barks. Subject 7 didn't growl. It didn't break stride. It simply turned its massive scarred head toward the loudest pup, flared its nostrils, and let out a low, bass-heavy thrum from deep inside its chest. The sound vibrated the loose tools on a nearby workbench. The 3 younger beasts immediately dropped to their bellies, whining and tucking their tails. "Quiet down, you worthless mud scrapers," a voice boomed. A Dra handler stepped into the central aisle, blocking Caleb's path. He was wearing the heavy localized gravity boots required for their species. A fresh-faced, heavily muscled war beast stood at his side, its chains pulled taut. "You're in the wrong bay meat-tat," the Dra grunted, crossing his massive arms. "Support staff quarters are 3 decks down." "This is heavy armor." Caleb stopped. He didn't look at the Drax's face. He looked at the heavy combat knife strapped to the alien's thigh, then up at his wide, flat chest. "I was assigned bunk 42, Caleb said, his voice flat. He pointed a thumb over his shoulder. With him, the DRA looked at Subject 7, then back at Caleb, and let out a sound like a boulder grinding against concrete. A laugh. The system made an error. They don't put humans in heavy armor. You don't have the mass to restrain a Class A asset. When that old relic gets spooked and goes into a combat frenzy, you won't be able to hold the chain." "I don't plan on using a chain," Caleb said. A murmur ran through the barracks. The Dra took a heavy step forward, closing the distance. "Listen to me, little primate. I am Cadet, First Class Garon. I am the pack leader of this bay. I say who sleeps where, and I say you turn around and march your soft, fragile bones back to the quartermaster." Inside Caleb's mind, the empathic link flared. It wasn't a thought. It was a sudden, violent spike of temperature. A wave of possessive, localized fury washed over his brain. Subject 7 shifted its weight, dropping its head. The heavy bone crest on its skull angled forward. A growl started in its throat like a localized earthquake. Threat, crush, protect. Caleb reached out. He didn't look at the beast. He just pressed his open palm flat against the center of Subject 7's snout. The growl died instantly. The beast huffed irritated, but sat down right where it was, its heavy tail thumping impatiently against the floor. Caleb stepped past the beast, closing the final 2 feet between himself and Goran. He had to crane his neck slightly to look the Dra in the eyes. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't posture. He just let the utter grinding exhaustion of his past 3 tours bleed into his tone. "Let me explain something to you, Goran," Caleb said softly. "You think you're the baddest thing in this room because you weigh 600 pounds, but you grew up in a clean orbital nursery. You had scheduled meals and simulated gravity. I grew up in the flooded ruins of Earth, fighting scrap hounds for half-rotten synth rats. I've survived orbital bombardments that turned entire continents into glass." Caleb tapped his own chest right over his heart. "I didn't stop him from tearing your throat out because I'm afraid of you." Caleb whispered, his eyes dead and cold. "I stopped him because if he kills you, I have to fill out the paperwork, and I really, really hate paperwork." Goran stared down at the human. He looked at Caleb's eyes, expecting to see the frantic, twitchy fear of a smaller prey animal bluffing. He didn't see it. He saw the cold, mechanical calculus of a creature deciding exactly where to stick a blade to hit a vital artery. Then Goran looked past Caleb. Subject 7 was sitting perfectly still, but its amber eyes were locked dead on Goran's center of mass. The beast wasn't chained. It wasn't restrained. It was simply waiting for the human to drop his hand. Goran swallowed hard. He took a slow, deliberate step back. "Bunk 42 is in the back," Goran muttered, breaking eye contact. "Keep that thing away from my gear." Caleb held his gaze for 1 more second, establishing the absolute finality of the conversation. Then he turned, patted Subject 7 on the shoulder, and walked down the aisle. The beast fell into step right behind him. The rest of the handlers watched them pass in absolute silence. They reached bunk 42. It was a miserable corner slot positioned right next to the massive vibrating exhaust vents of the life support scrubbers. The noise was a constant, irritating thrum. Caleb tossed his duffel onto the bare metal slab. He sat down the rigid Dura steel, entirely unforgiving against his spine. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, and put his head in his hands. The adrenaline from the staging bay was finally crashing, leaving behind a hollow, aching fatigue. A heavy, wet nose nudged his elbow. Caleb looked up. Subject 7 was standing there, staring at him. The beast turned in a tight circle, scratching at the deck plates with its massive claws, then collapsed with a heavy sigh, resting its massive head right on Caleb's boots. Caleb felt a warm, steady pressure in his mind. Safe, pack, rest. Caleb reached down, scratching the thick, scaled ridge behind the beast's ears. Yeah, Caleb muttered, closing his eyes. Pack, let's get some sleep, big guy. They lasted exactly 4 hours before the hunger woke them. Caleb's stomach was a tight, painful knot. Military rations during selection were designed to keep you alive, not full. He sat up the metal bunk, groaning under his shifting weight. At his feet, Subject 7 stirred. The beast lifted its head, let out a massive jaw-cracking yawn that displayed a terrifying array of serrated bone, and looked at Caleb, empty hunt. The projection in Caleb's mind was sharp, primal, and insistent. I know, Caleb said, grabbing his boots. Let's go see what passes for food in this place. The mess hall for the heavy armor wing was a massive utilitarian cavern. At one end, the handlers queued up for trays of dense protein blocks and nutrient-infused water. At the other end, the war beasts were led to a row of deep stainless steel troughs. Caleb walked Subject 7 over to the troughs. A bored-looking supply drone hovered nearby, dispensing a thick gray slurry into the metal basins. It smelled like wet cardboard and copper wire. Subject 7 sniffed the slurry. The beast sneezed violently, shaking its massive head, and took a step back. It looked at Caleb. The emotion rolling across their bond was pure, unadulterated disgust. Caleb leaned over the trough. He dipped a finger into the gray paste and smelled it. Then deliberately he tasted a tiny fraction of it. He immediately spat it out onto the floor. Ash meal and synthetic bone dust. Caleb muttered, wiping his tongue on his sleeve. It's bulk filler. No wonder you're pissed off all the time. You're running on empty calories. He looked at the beast. Don't eat that garbage. Come with me. Caleb bypassed the handler's ration line entirely and walked straight toward the heavy doors of the Quardrum's kitchen. A red light flashed above the frame. Restricted area. Staff only. Caleb hit the manual override. The door slid open. The kitchen was a labyrinth of cold storage lockers and prep stations. A human was sitting at a metal desk near the back-tallying inventory on a data pad. He was older, his hair peppered with gray, wearing the grease-stained fatigues of a logistics officer. His name tag read Miller. Miller looked up, his eyes widening as Caleb walked in, completely ignoring protocol with a 0 pounds apex predator trailing behind him. Hey, Caleb said, leaning against Miller's desk. You, Miller, are you insane? Miller hissed, pushing his chair back. You can't bring a Class A in here. The sterilization protocols alone. He's not eating the gray, Caleb interrupted. His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it that made Miller freeze. He's a 0 pounds of high twitch muscle. He needs actual protein, fats, iron, not synthetic ash meal. Miller blinked. He looked at Caleb, really looking at him for the first time. He noted the faded outer rim deployment patches on Caleb's jacket. He noted the way Caleb stood relaxed but balanced on the balls of his feet. You're the human, Miller said. The one the whole base is talking about. Alpha 7, Caleb, he corrected. And this is? Caleb looked back at the beast. Subject 7 was a label, a barcode for a piece of equipment. It didn't fit. The beast was staring at a row of cold storage lockers, drool starting to pull at the corner of its armored jaws. It looked rugged, stubborn, and completely unimpressed with authority. His name is Duke, Caleb decided right then. Duke's ears twitched At the sound, Duke, Caleb projected the concept into the empathic link, a sense of identity, a title. Duke huffed, bumping Caleb's hip with his snout. He accepted it. "Listen to me, Caleb," Miller said, lowering his voice. "I just manage the inventory. The beast feed is standard coalition protocol. If I start handing out high-grade organic protein to an animal, Command will strip my rank and throw me in the brig." Caleb leaned closer. "Miller, where are you from?" "New Texas Colony," Miller replied wearily. "I'm from Earth," Caleb said. "Detroit ruins. We both know the Coalition treats humanity like disposable shock troops. They throw us in the meat grinder because we're cheap to replace. They do the same thing to these beasts. They starve them of what they actually need, keep them on edge, and point them at the enemy. Then they put them down when they break." Caleb gestured to Duke. "He's an old soldier, just like us. He doesn't need to be kept on edge. He needs to trust me. And he can't trust me if I'm feeding him cardboard." Miller looked at the beast. Duke was sitting quietly watching the exchange with an intelligence that was distinctly unnerving. "I have some surplus," Miller muttered, looking down at his data pad. "Cloned loin slabs, grade B meant for the officers' mess, but a shipment got flagged for freezer burn. I was supposed to incinerate it." "I'll take it," Caleb said. "All of it." Miller sighed, standing up and walking over to a heavy locker. He punched in a code and the door hissed open, spilling freezing vapor across the floor. He dragged out a massive 40-pound slab of deep red meat wrapped in clear plast. He threw it onto a prep table. "You're going to get us both court-martialed, kid." "I've survived worse," Caleb said. He grabbed a cleaver from the rack, stripped the plastile, and chopped the slab into massive, jagged chunks. He tossed the first piece into the air. Duke didn't leap for it. He didn't scramble. His jaws just snapped shut with the sound of a steel trap closing, taking the meat directly out of the air. He swallowed it whole. Caleb fed him piece by piece. With every bite, Caleb felt the empathic bond thickening. It was no longer just a thread of shared violence. It was becoming a cable of profound primal trust. The beast was starving for calories, yes, but it was also starving for someone to simply provide for it. Not out of fear and not out of protocol, but out of pack loyalty. When the meat was gone, Duke licked the blood off the metal table with a tongue like coarse sandpaper. He let out a deep rumbling burp that rattled the hanging pans, then pressed his heavy forehead squarely against Caleb's chest. Full pack alpha. Caleb rested his hands on the thick armor of Duke's neck. For the first time since he had been drafted into the Coalition, Caleb Hayes didn't feel entirely alone. "Get out of here before the patrol droids cycle through," Miller grumbled, pretending to be busy with his data pad, but he slid a smaller foil-wrapped package across the desk. "And here, real coffee. Don't ask where I got it." Caleb took the package. "Thanks, Miller." "Just don't get eaten, kid," Miller replied. "Bad for morale." At 0400 hours the next morning, the klaxon screamed. The heavy armor bay erupted into calculated chaos. Handlers scrambled into their rigid impact suits, locking heavy armor plates over their chests and shins. The beasts barked, roared, and strained against their chains, the sudden noise and adrenaline throwing them into a pre-combat frenzy. Caleb sat on the edge of bunk 42, slowly lacing up his standard Sioux infantry boots. He didn't have impact armor. The quartermaster hadn't issued any in human sizes. He just wore his drab olive fatigues, his tactical vest, and an old battered helmet that had seen 3 different planets. Beside him, Duke was dead silent. The beast was watching the frantic alien cadets with a look of profound boredom. He didn't need klaxons to tell him it was time to fight. He could smell it in the air. "Listen up, mate." Drill Master Rusk's voice bellowed through the bay's comms. "Today is your first live fire integration drill. You will deploy to the proving grounds. Sector 4. The objective is to hold the high ground against a mechanized assault. Failure means a week of latrine duty. Lethal force is authorized on the drones. Non-lethal stun rounds only for organic targets. Move." The dropship ride was brutal. The turbulence rattled Caleb's teeth, and the cramped troop compartment smelled of fear, sweat, and weapon oil. Goran and the other elite cadets sat perfectly rigid, their beasts muzzled and chained tight to the floor rings. Caleb sat near the loading ramp. Duke wasn't chained. He was sprawled out across the deck plates, his massive head resting on Caleb's lap, fast asleep. The vibration of the engines seemed to soothe him. Goran glared at Caleb from across the bay. "You're going to fail, human. Sector 4 is an exposed ridge. The automated turrets alone will chew that unarmored suit to shreds. And when your beast panics and runs, you'll be left in the mud." Caleb didn't open his eyes. He just kept scratching behind Duke's ears. "Worry about your own flank, Goran. My dog and I will be just fine." The drop ship hit the dirt hard. The ramp dropped instantly, flooding the compartment with cold rain and the smell of ozone. Sector 4 was a miserable stretch of blasted rock and deep, thick mud. The high ground was a reinforced bunker sitting atop a steep incline. Rusk stood in the center of the mud pit, rain slicking off his cybernetic face. "Take your positions. The assault begins in 3 minutes." The Cray and DRA handlers immediately rushed for the bunker. They dragged their beasts inside the concrete walls, setting up heavy repeating blasters in the narrow firing slits. It was standard coalition doctrine. Build a fortress, put your biggest guns inside, and weather the storm. Caleb didn't go to the bunker. He looked at the terrain. To the left of the bunker was a massive cratered expanse of deep mud and jagged rocks. It was technically the flank, but it was completely exposed. Alpha 7, Rusk barked over the comms. "Get in the bunker. You are violating defensive protocols." "Negative, Drill Master," Caleb replied, keying his throat. "Mike, if they have mechanized armor, they'll just shell the bunker from a distance. The bunker is a coffin. I'm taking the mud." Silence on the comms. Then Rusk's voice tight with anger. "Your funeral, cadet." Caleb walked out into the driving rain, Duke plodding heavily beside him. They stopped in the center of the cratered field. The mud was ankle deep. Caleb knelt down in the sludge. He looked Duke in the eyes. "Listen to me, buddy," Caleb said, the empathic link flaring wide open. He projected an image, not of standing and roaring, not of charging headlong into laser fire. He projected the memory of the trench wars, hiding, waiting, the lethal patience of a trap snapping shut. Duke's ears flicked forward. He understood perfectly. It went against his coalition training, but it aligned perfectly with his predatory instincts. Hide, wait, kill, dig, Caleb ordered. Duke didn't hesitate. The massive beast dropped to his belly and used his heavy shovel-like claws to gouge a massive trench into the soft mud. In seconds he had hollowed out a depression deep enough to swallow his entire bulk. He laid down in it the black armor of his back, blending perfectly with the dark, wet earth. He lowered his head, closing his bright amber eyes to mere slits. Caleb grabbed handfuls of the thick, cold mud and smeared it over Duke's exposed armor plates, breaking up his silhouette and masking his thermal signature. Then Caleb slid into the trench beside him, pressing his back against the beast's warm, heavily armored flank. He dragged a fallen rusted bulkhead plate over them, leaving only a narrow slit to see the field. They vanished. 3 minutes later, the assault began. A wave of heavy combat drones crested the far ridge. Behind them were the enemy cadets instructors in full tactical gear, laying down a punishing barrage of blue stun fire, just as Caleb predicted. The instructors didn't charge the bunker. They set up heavy mortar tubes and began pounding the concrete structure. The alien cadets inside fired back blindly, their beasts roaring in panic at the concussive blasts echoing inside the enclosed space. It was deafening. It was chaotic, and the cadets were losing. An instructor squad flanked by 2 heavily armored security mechs broke off from the main force. They began moving up the left flank, intending to circle behind the bunker and flush the cadets out. They marched right into the mud field, right over the crater. Caleb waited. He felt Duke's heart rate slowing down, not speeding up. The beast was perfectly calm. The ultimate ambush predator. The boots of the lead instructor squelched in the mud. Exactly 3 feet from Caleb's hiding spot. Now Caleb projected. The earth erupted. 0 pounds of armored muscle and pure unadulterated violence exploded from the ground. Duke didn't roar. Roaring wasted breath. He surged upward, his massive bulk slamming into the first security mech with the force of a freight train. The impact shattered the mech's gyroscope, sending it crashing into the mud. Before the instructors could even raise their rifles, Caleb was out of the hole. He didn't try to shoot them. He grabbed the nearest instructor by the tactical vest, using the man's own momentum to throw him face first into the sludge, ripping his rifle away in the process. Duke spun his spiked tail, sweeping low like a scythe, taking the legs out from under the remaining 3 instructors. They hit the deck in a tangle of limbs and panicked shouts. Duke planted a massive mud-covered paw firmly on the chest of the squad leader, pinning him to the ground. The beast lowered its head jaws inches from the man's faceplate and let out a soft, terrifying rumble. Caleb stood over them, the stolen rifle leveled at the squad. He was covered in mud, his eyes burning with a fierce, cold intensity. Up on the observation deck, Drill Master Rusk watched the tactical feed. He saw the bunker failing. He saw the elite Cray and the HFY cadets pinned down and terrified. And then he saw the human. He saw the human and the untamable war beast, working in absolute silent synchronization. They hadn't fought like soldiers. They had fought like a pack of starving wolves. Rusk's cybernetic eye zooming in on Caleb standing over the defeated squad. By the void, Rusk whispered to himself, The coalition had spent decades trying to program the beasts to fight like men. Caleb Hayes was doing something far more dangerous. He was teaching the beast how to fight like a human, and humanity fought dirty. The rain had washed most of the sludge off Duke's armor by the time they reached the extraction point, but Caleb was still coated in it. The thick gray mud had dried into a rigid crust over his fatigues. He didn't care. He sat on the lowered ramp of the dropship, a purloined ration bar in his hand, tossing small broken pieces into the air. Duke caught every single one with the mechanical precision of a trash compactor. Across the landing zone, the rest of the heavy armor battalion looked like a parade ground disaster. The Krail and Dra cadets had survived the bunker, but barely. Their pristine impact suits were scorched black by plasma fire. Several of their younger beasts were whining, pacing in frantic neurotic circles, their nerves utterly shattered by the concussive echo of the mortar barrage. Goran marched toward Caleb, his heavy boots displacing water in angry splashing stops. The Drax's face was bruised a deep mottled purple, where a chunk of spalled concrete had caught him beneath his visor. "You broke protocol," Goran snarled, stopping 3 feet from Caleb. His hand rested heavily on the grip of his plasma sidearm. "You abandoned the defensive perimeter. You hid in the dirt like an insect." Caleb didn't look up. He broke off another piece of the ration bar, tossed it. Duke snapped it out of the air. "I won the objective," Caleb said softly. "You got pinned down and shelled. If those were high explosive rounds instead of stun charges, you'd be scraping your squad out of the bunker with a spoon. It is cowardice." Goran roared his voice, carrying over the idle hum of the dropship engines. "We are the vanguard. We stand the line. We do not gravel in the mud and strike from the shadows. You have infected that noble beast with human weakness." Duke stopped chewing. The beast didn't growl. It simply lowered its massive head, its amber eyes locking onto Goran. The empathic link between Caleb and the beast spiked with a sudden suffocating wave of cold pressure. It wasn't the frantic hot anger of a wild animal. It was the absolute icy stillness of an apex predator calculating the exact force required to crush a windpipe. Goran's young war beast, chained heavily to the Drax's left wrist, let out a terrified whimper. It scrambled backward, its claws sparking against the metal deck, pulling the chain taut as it tried to put as much distance between itself and Duke as possible. Caleb finally stood up. The dried mud flaked off his uniform. He stepped into Goran's personal space. "There's nothing noble about dying for a doctrine." Goran Caleb whispered, his voice dead flat. "The enemy doesn't care about your medals. They don't care about your formations. They only care if you're breathing. And right now my squad is breathing. And yours is a simulated casualty report." Cadet Hayes is correct. The synthetic grating voice cut through the tension like a buzzsaw. Drill Master Rusk stepped out of the shadows of the dropship bay, his cybernetic eye whirring as it adjusted to the harsh flood lights. He was accompanied by a human officer. The man wore the crisp, unblemished uniform of a coalition colonel. A silver name plate on his chest read Briggs. "Stand down, Goran," Rusk ordered. "Your squad failed because you relied on armor instead of tactics. You were predictable. Hayes was not." Goran ground his teeth, his mandibles clicking in frustration, but he bowed his head rigidly and backed away, dragging his panicked beast with him. Colonel Briggs stepped forward. He looked Caleb up and down his nose, wrinkling slightly at the smell of mud, ozone, and wet animal. He looked at Duke. The beast stared back entirely unimpressed and let out a long, wet sneeze that splattered mud across the colonel's polished boots. Briggs didn't flinch. "I reviewed the tactical feed, Cadet. You didn't just ambush the instructor squad. You coordinated a synchronized strike with a Class A siege asset without using a single verbal command or neural tether." "We understand each other, sir," Caleb said. The beast acted like a guerrilla fighter. Briggs continued, his eyes narrowing. It suppressed its own thermal signature. It understood the concept of camouflage. These beasts are engineered for shock and awe frontline combat. They aren't supposed to know how to set traps. Maybe they just needed someone to show them how, Caleb replied. Briggs pulled a data pad from his belt. Command is intrigued. They want to reassign Subject 7 to the Advanced Behavioral Labs on Core Prime. They want to map its neural pathways, figure out how a human managed to imprint on a defective asset. Caleb's heart turned to lead. The empathic link flared with sudden sharp anxiety, not his own, but Duke's. The beast had spent years in cages, poked and prodded by scientists trying to fix what they deemed broken. "With respect, Colonel," Caleb said, his voice tightening. "He's not defective, and he's not a lab rat. He's a soldier. If you take him to Core Prime, he won't let them touch him. He'll kill the first technician who comes near him with a needle, and then you'll have to put him down." Briggs looked at Caleb, a cold corporate detachment in his eyes. "You're a Cadet Hayes. You don't own coalition property." Before Caleb could respond, the bass klaxons fired. Not the sharp staccato blare of a training drill. This was a deep bone-rattling wail. The floodlights around the landing zone instantly snapped off, plunging the yard into darkness, replaced a second later by the dull, bloody glow of emergency red lighting. "Incoming trajectory," a voice screamed over the base-wide comms. "Multiple unidentified contacts entering high atmosphere. No transponder codes. They are hot." Rusk slapped his comms bead. "Air defense report. Track those targets. They're ignoring the orbital guns." The comms officer yelled panic, edging his voice. "They're diving straight through the flex screen. Atmospheric entry in 20 seconds. Point of impact is us. They're dropping right on the academy." Caleb looked up at the sky. Through the heavy clouds and the driving rain, he could see them. Streaks of fiery orange burning through the atmosphere. Not drop pods, boarding spikes. "They're not trying to destroy the base," Caleb said, the realization hitting him like a physical blow. "They're trying to breach it." Briggs drew his sidearm. "All personnel lock and load. This is not a drill." Duke let out a roar that shook the dropship chassis. The empathic link slammed into Caleb's mind. It wasn't anxiety anymore. It was pure, unfiltered anticipation. The beast didn't care about politics. It didn't care about labs. The enemy was coming, and Duke was hungry. The boarding spikes hit the academy grounds like meteorites. The impacts were deafening. One of the massive tungsten-tipped cylinders smashed directly through the roof of the administrative wing, sending a shock wave that threw Caleb off his feet. The ground heaved. Concrete shattered into shrapnel, raining down on the staging area in a lethal shower. Caleb hit the deck, covering the back of his neck. A heavy armored bulk immediately draped over him. Duke had thrown himself over Caleb, the beast's thick carapace deflecting chunks of debris that would have snapped Caleb's spine. "Get up." "Hey, Wendy," Rusk bellowed his voice, cutting through the ringing in Caleb's ears. The drill master was already firing his sidearm at the nearest spike. The sides of the boarding spikes blew outward with explosive force. Through the smoke and the driving rain, the raiders emerged. They were mercenaries, hardened, cybernetically enhanced brutalists from the fringes of the Terminus systems. They wore scavenged heavy assault armor painted in jagged, irregular patterns. They carried rotary plasma cannons, heavy kinetic shotguns, and thermal monolades. They weren't here to hold territory. They were here for a smash-and-grab defensive formation. Goran roared, trying to rally the alien cadets. The Dra and Kree handlers scrambled, dragging their terrified beasts into a rigid phalanx, locking their heavy shields together to create a wall of armor. It was exactly what they had been taught. It was exactly the wrong thing to do. The raiders didn't engage the shield wall. They bypassed it entirely. A squad of mercenaries equipped with jump packs vaulted high into the air, clearing the cadet formation and landed directly behind them. The slaughter began instantly. The TRA cadets, their long limbs tangled in the chains of their own panicking beasts, couldn't turn fast enough. Heavy shotgun blasts tore through their rear lines. The young war beasts, driven completely feral by the noise and the scent of sudden blood, began snapping at their own handlers in blind terror. "They're butchering them," Colonel Briggs shouted, firing his pistol into the smoke. A stray plasma bolt caught the officer high in the shoulder, spinning him around and dropping him to the deck. Caleb rolled out from under Duke. The empathic link was a raging furnace of adrenaline, but Caleb forced a lid on it. He couldn't let the beast give in to the frenzy. He needed a scalpel, not a sledgehammer. Focus. Caleb projected into the link, sending a wave of icy calm with me in the shadows. Duke shook his massive head, snapping his jaws, but he obeyed. The beast dropped low to the ground, blending into the dark, smoke-filled rain. Caleb sprinted for the nearest piece of cover, a blown-out supply crawler. He snatched up a dropped plasma rifle from a fallen Kree cadet as he ran, checking the charge pack half full. It would have to do. "Rusk," Caleb yelled over the comms. "Their heavy weapons are tearing the phalanx apart. Goran's squad is boxed in." "I see it." Hayes Rusk fired a sustained burst, taking down a raider. "I can't break through. The crossfire is too dense." Caleb looked at the battlefield. The mercenaries were methodical, advancing in tight squads, laying down suppressing fire, while their jump troops flanked. They were pushing the cadets back toward the open M of the boarding spikes, likely intending to steal the war beasts and execute the handlers. "We need to break their rhythm," Caleb muttered. He looked at Duke. The beast was crouched beside the crawler, its eyes tracking the jump troops with lethal intensity. Caleb pointed to the right flank where a heavy gunner was laying down a continuous stream of plasma fire, pinning down Goran and the survivors. Hunt Caleb projected. Duke vanished. The beast didn't run. It flowed. 1,000 pounds of muscle, moving with absolute silence through the smoke and the wreckage. Caleb didn't wait. He moved left, using the chaos as cover. He flanked a squad of 3 mercenaries, pushing toward the bunker. He didn't fire. Muzzle flash would give away his position. He drew the heavy combat knife from his vest. He slipped behind the rearmost mercenary. Caleb wrapped his left arm around the raider's visor, snapping his head back, and drove the knife deep into the unarmored joint beneath the jawline. He lowered the dying man quietly to the deck, stepping over the body before the other 2 even realized their squad mate was gone. Across the staging area, the heavy gunner suddenly stopped firing. There was no gunshot. There was no explosion. There was only a wet, sickening crunch that echoed loudly, even over the chaos of the battle. The remaining mercenaries turned just in time to see Duke emerge from the smoke. The beast had the heavy gunner clamped entirely in its jaws. With a brutal sideways snap of its neck, Duke tossed the armored raider 20 feet through the air like a discarded ragged doll. The raiders panicked. They turned their weapons on the beast. Now Caleb yelled. He stepped out from behind cover and opened fire with the plasma rifle. He didn't aim for the heavily armored chests. He aimed for the knees, the weapon joints, the jump-pack fuel lines. He fought with the dirty, ruthless efficiency of the Detroit ruins. Disable, kill. Caught between the sudden, accurate flank fire from the human and the absolute terror of the black armored monster tearing through their lines, the raiders broke formation. "Goran, move!" Caleb screamed into the comms. The dray saw the opening. With a roar that shook the rain, Yaron dropped his shield and charged his heavy plasma repeater, chewing through the disorganized mercenaries. The surviving cadets followed their fear, turning into desperate, violent rage. Caleb and Duke didn't join the main charge. They moved through the periphery, a ghost and a monster. When a raider tried to fall back and reload, Caleb put a plasma bolt through his visor. When a jump trooper tried to launch, Duke launched with him, grabbing the mercenary out of the air and slamming him back into the concrete. They were a perfectly synchronized machine. Caleb was the eyes and the strategy. Duke was the muscle and the execution. Through the empathic link, they shared a singular, terrifying flow state. Caleb felt the impact of Duke's claws tearing through armor. Duke felt the cold, calculated geometry of Caleb's firing angles. They were pack, and the mercenaries were prey. The staging area was a slaughterhouse. The boarding spikes lay dark and silent. Their automated system shot out or disabled. The rain had slowed to a miserable drizzle, washing the thick, glowing streaks of alien blood into the storm drains. Of the 40 raiders that had breached the academy, none were left standing. Caleb stood in the center of the yard, his chest heaving the barrel of his plasma rifle, glowing a dull, angry orange. His uniform was torn, a shallow laceration, weeping blood across his cheek, but he was alive. Beside him, Duke sat heavily on the concrete. The beast's breathing was ragged. A grazing plasma burn scored the thick armor on his left shoulder, exposing the raw gray hide beneath, but he didn't seem to notice. The beast looked up at Caleb, let out a long, shuddering sigh, and pressed his massive, bloody snout against Caleb's leg. Safe. Hack stands. Caleb dropped the empty rifle and sank his fingers into the thick, coarse ridge behind Duke's ears. Thick, coarse ridge behind Duke's ears. "Yeah, buddy, we stand." Goran limped over. The giant draw was bleeding from a dozen shrapnel wounds. His young beast trailed behind him, no longer snarling but utterly exhausted. Goran stopped in front of Caleb. For a long moment, the Dra just stared at the human. He looked at the carnage. He looked at the way the raiders had been dismantled, not by overwhelming force, but by tactical precision and absolute savagery. Slowly, deliberately, Goran unclipped the heavy chain from his own beast's collar. He dropped the Duracell links onto the deck with a loud clang. Then Goran struck his right fist over his heart and bowed his heavy head. "I was wrong, Alpha 7. Goran rumbled, his voice thick with exhaustion and newfound respect. "There is no cowardice in survival. You fought for the pack. Your beast fought for the pack. We owe you our lives." Caleb nodded slowly. "We're all in the mud together, Goran. Keep your chain if you want, but you won't need it if your dog trusts you." Drill Master Rusk approached, holding a field dressing against his cybernetic jaw, sparks occasionally spitting from the damaged wiring. Med-evac shuttles were already descending through the clouds, their blue emergency strobes cutting through the gloom. Colonel Briggs stabilized. Rusk reported, his one organic eye locked on Caleb. "Command is already demanding a full report. The raiders were after the Class A breeding stock. They failed." Rusk looked down at Duke. The beast didn't growl at the drill master this time. He just blinked slowly, utterly secure in his place beside the human. The colonel's orders to transfer the beast to Core Prime. Caleb started, his voice hardening. "We're lost in the chaos of the attack." Rusk interrupted smoothly. The drill's mangled mouth twitched upward in what might have been a smile. "Tragic loss of data. The colonel suffered a severe concussion. His memory of the event is likely to be confused. I will be filing the official after-action report myself." Rusk stepped closer, his voice dropping to a low growl only Caleb could hear. "The Coalition has spent 50 years trying to build a better weapon haze. They built collars, chains, and neural whips. They thought control was the same thing as loyalty." Rusk gestured to the field of fallen mercenaries. "You just proved them wrong. You didn't break the beast. You joined it." "He's a good dog," Caleb said simply. "He is a nightmare," Rusk corrected. "And so are you. The brass won't know what to do with you. You don't fit their algorithms, but they can't deny the results." Rusk turned to walk back to the command bunker. "Clean your weapon, Alpha 7. Tomorrow we start advanced infantry tactics, and I expect you to rewrite the manual." Caleb watched the drill master walk away. The adrenaline was finally leaving his system, replaced by the deep aching fatigue that always followed a fight. He looked down at Duke. The massive war beast looked back. There was no fear. There was no wild, uncontrollable fury. There was just the quiet, absolute certainty of a creature that had finally found its home. "Come on," Caleb muttered, tapping the side of Duke's armored neck. "Let's go find Miller. I think we earned the good protein tonight." Duke huffed his tail, giving a single heavy thump against the deck, and lumbered to his feet. They walked back toward the heavy armor wing, side by side, a fragile human and a monster from a death world walking perfectly in sync. The galaxy was a massive hostile place. The Coalition thought they ruled it with pristine armor and rigid doctrine. But humanity had always known a darker truth. You don't survive the dark by building a thicker wall. You survive by making friends with the biggest monster in the room. And then you let them off the leash.